She turned down millionaires. She walked away from athletes. She laughed at the idea of settling. Everyone around her said she was too picky, too proud, too impossible to love. And for years, she believed them. She told herself she was just waiting for the right one, the one who matched her ambition, the one who didn't need her to shrink herself, the one who was, by every measure, her equal. And then, one autumn evening in Chicago, she found him. Or rather, he found her. His name, he told her, was James Park. He said it the way men say things when they already know it will land well, not rushed, not nervous, just settled. Like a man who has introduced himself 1,000 times and never once needed to explain himself afterward. He was Korean-American, he said, born in Seoul, raised partially in the States. And he spoke English without an accent, smiled with his whole face, and wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He told her he ran an international technology investment firm. He told her he had offices in Chicago, Singapore, and Seoul. He told her he had been looking for someone real in a city full of people performing realness. And she, who had spent a lifetime being told she was too much, felt for the first time like she was exactly enough. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that James Park did not exist. The man standing in front of her was a ghost, a constructed human being assembled from stolen documents, fabricated histories, and years of practiced deception. His real name was not James. His company was not real. His money, all of it, was being funneled through a network so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in the American financial system, that the FBI and the Department of Justice had been hunting it for years without being able to find the man at the center of it. And that man was standing right in front of her, holding a glass of champagne, asking for her number. Before we go any further, we'd love to know where in the world you're watching this from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We read every single one. And if stories like this are the reason you come here, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what we put out next. Because this story, this one right here, is unlike anything we have ever covered. And it is only just beginning. Here is what we know. And here is what, for a long time, nobody was willing to say out loud. We know that the man who called himself James Park was operating inside a financial fraud network that spanned at least 3 continents. We know that for more than 4 years, he moved money across international borders using stolen identities, shell companies, and a web of fake documentation so elaborate that the people processing his transactions never once had reason to question it. We know that the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had a file on this network. We know that Interpol had flagged movement associated with this scheme across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim. And we know that despite all of that, despite every alarm, every red flag, every classified brief that crossed somebody's desk, this man was never caught. And until a woman named Lauren Mitchell went looking for her husband's insurance papers and found something she was never supposed to see. Lauren Mitchell was 43 years old. She was a senior marketing director at a mid-sized pharmaceutical firm in Chicago. She owned her condo outright. She drove a sensible car. She had a dog named Charlie and a standing Friday dinner reservation at the same Italian restaurant she had been going to for 12 years. She was not naive. She was not reckless. She was not, by any measure, the kind of person you would expect to find herself inside a federal investigation involving North Korean state-sponsored financial operatives, forged American passports, and a man who had, over the course of 6 years, assumed at least 4 separate identities across 3 different countries. And yet, there she was. So here are the questions we are going to answer together. Who was James Park, really? Where did the money actually come from? And what was on that piece of paper she found in that drawer that caused her to sit down on the floor of her own bedroom and not move for 45 minutes? Because the answers to those questions do not just end a marriage. They reach into something much larger, Something that, even now, federal investigators will not discuss on the record. Something that began not in Chicago, but in a city called Pyongyang. Stay with us, because this story is going to go somewhere you are not expecting. To understand how a woman like Lauren Mitchell ended up where she ended up, you have to understand who she was before any of this happened. Because the story that is easiest to tell, the one where a lonely woman was swept off her feet by a charming man with money, is not her story. That is not who she was. And getting that wrong matters, because it changes everything about what happened to her and why she made the choices she made once the truth began to surface. Lauren grew up in Naperville, Illinois, second of 3 kids. Her father was an electrician. Her mother worked as a school administrator. They were not wealthy, but they were stable. And Lauren internalized that stability as a kind of personal standard. You worked hard. You built something real. You did not take shortcuts, and you did not let people take shortcuts around you. She carried that with her through college at the University of Illinois, but through a decade of grinding up the ladder at 2 different marketing firms, and through a marriage in her early 30s that lasted 4 years before ending quietly, without drama, without screaming matches. Just the slow, mutual recognition that they had grown into different people, and neither of them was wrong for it. By the time she was in her early 40s, Lauren Mitchell had become exactly what she set out to be: independent, accomplished, careful. Her friends described her as someone with excellent instincts. Her colleagues called her one of the sharpest people in any room she walked into. She had dated after her divorce a few times, nothing serious, and had reached that specific kind of peace that comes not from giving up on love, but from genuinely not needing it to feel complete. Which is, of course, at the exact moment when the wrong kind of man finds you most attractive. Not because you are vulnerable, but because you are not. Because you are going to require more effort, more construction, more careful, long-game work. And James Park, whoever he really was extraordinarily good at long-game work. They met at a charity gala in the fall of 2019. It was an Arts Foundation event on the 32nd floor of a building in the Loop. Lauren was there with a colleague from work. She was not there to meet anyone. She remembers thinking the hors d'oeuvres were disappointing and that the keynote speaker was running long, and that she was calculating in her head how quickly she could leave without seeming rude when a man appeared beside her at the bar and said, without looking at her, "The keynote speaker has been going for 11 minutes longer than the program said he would. I've been timing it." And she laughed, because it was exactly what she had been thinking. And the precision of it, the fact that he had been counting the minutes, struck her not as odd, but as someone who valued time, someone who paid attention to the details everyone else let slide. She found out later that noticing what people value and reflecting it back to them was one of the primary tools in his operational playbook. But that night, it just felt like chemistry. He pursued her steadily over the following 3 months, not desperately, not overwhelming. He was too smart for that. 2 dinners in October. A visit to an exhibit at the Art Institute in November because he had remembered in passing that she mentioned liking photography. And a weekend trip to New York in December, where he had somehow secured a table at a restaurant with a 6-month waiting list and simply acted as though that were normal. He introduced her to people, colleagues, he said, friends from his business circles, all of whom confirmed the same story. Successful man, international connections, genuinely good person. She did not know yet that several of those people had been paid to play those roles. She did not know yet that the New York restaurant reservation had been obtained through a fraudulent corporate account. She did not know yet that she was being shown a stage set, constructed specifically for her, by people who had done this before. They got engaged in March of 2020. They were married that October in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside of Chicago. 14 guests. No extravagance. Because Lauren had insisted on that. She did not want a performance. She wanted something real, and he gave her exactly what she asked for, which was, in retrospect, perhaps the most devastating thing he ever did. While Lauren Mitchell was going about her life, working, cooking dinner, walking Charlie through Lincoln Park on Sunday mornings, building what she believed was a shared future with her husband, the man she knew as James Park was doing something else entirely. According to what investigators would later piece together, the man using the James Park identity was a highly trained operative embedded inside a financial fraud network that federal prosecutors have described as one of the most sophisticated of its kind ever prosecuted on American soil. He was not, as he claimed, a technology investor. The company name he used, a clean, corporate-sounding LLC registered in Illinois, was a shell, created using documentation provided by a network of facilitators whose job was to make people like him look legitimate to American banks, American employers, and American government agencies. The money flowing through the accounts attached to his identity was not investment income. It was wages and laundered funds generated by overseas workers who were themselves operating under stolen American identities inside major U.S. corporations, including Fortune 500 companies, an aerospace manufacturer, a major television network, and a Silicon Valley technology firm. And to understand the scale of what was happening around Lauren Mitchell, and without her knowledge, you need to understand what federal investigators had been tracking for years before she ever met this man. North Korea, which has been under strict international sanctions since the early 2000s, had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated program to generate hard currency by embedding trained operatives inside American companies as remote IT workers. These were not amateurs. These were people recruited from elite technical universities in Pyongyang, trained in foreign languages, and coached extensively on how to pass as American professionals in remote work environments. They used stolen social security numbers, fabricated employment histories, and forged driver's licenses to secure jobs at companies that believed they were hiring American citizens. The money they earned, millions of dollars every year, was quietly siphoned back to Pyongyang, where it funded, among other things, North Korea's nuclear weapons development program. The FBI, the State Department, and the Treasury Department had been issuing internal advisories about this program since 2022. By 2023, federal investigators estimated that North Korea had deployed thousands of such operatives inside the American economy. The man Lauren knew as James Park was one of the people who kept that network running inside the United States. His role, as prosecutors would later describe it, was as a high-level facilitator, the kind of person who managed the American side logistics of the operation, who ensured that the money moved cleanly, who maintained the fictional identities used by the overseas workers, and who provided the legal and financial cover that allowed the whole machine to keep turning without triggering the automated fraud detection systems that U.S. banks and corporations rely on. He was, in the language federal prosecutors use, a sophisticated actor, and his marriage to Lauren Mitchell, whether or not she knew it, had given him something invaluable. It had given him a real American address, a real American woman's name on shared financial accounts, and the kind of domestic legitimacy that makes a man invisible to the systems designed to catch people exactly like him. It was a Tuesday in December 2021. James, she still called him that in her head, would continue to call him that for months after this night. Because the brain does not easily surrender names, even when names turn out to be lies. James was traveling. Seoul, he had said. A meeting about a potential acquisition. He had kissed her goodbye on Monday morning, told her he would be back by the weekend, and left. Lauren worked from home that day. She walked Charlie in the afternoon. She made soup for dinner. And then, around 9 in the evening, she went to the home office they shared to look for the auto insurance renewal documents, because she needed them for a call the following morning and thought he might have filed them away. She looked in the obvious places first. The top drawer of the filing cabinet, nothing. The second drawer, tax documents, utility records, old lease agreements from before they were married. and then the third drawer, and the one she had never had reason to open before because it had always been vaguely understood, the way things in shared spaces sometimes are, as his drawer, the one where he kept things she had no reason to need. She opened it, and there, beneath a folded piece of packing material, were 3 passports. She picked up the first one. It was a South Korean passport. The photo was his face. The name was not James Park. It was a name she did not recognize. She set it down. She picked up the second one. It was a Canadian passport. Same face. Different name again. She picked up the third one. It was South African. A third name. A third country. The same face in all 3, looking back at her with the same expression he always wore in photographs. Calm, slightly distant, like a man conserving something. She sat down on the floor of the office. Not because her legs gave out. She did not feel faint. She would describe it later, to investigators, as a completely deliberate choice. She sat down because she understood, in that specific and terrible instant, that whatever was about to happen next was going to require her to be very, very still. She sat there for 45 minutes. She did not call him. She did not call a friend. She did not call the police. She sat and she thought, which is, when you consider what she was up against, one of the most remarkable things about Lauren Mitchell. Because most people, in that moment, act on emotion. They call. They confront. They give the other person a chance to explain, which is exactly what someone in his position would need in order to run. Lauren did none of those things. She put the passports back exactly as she had found them. She closed the drawer. She went to bed, and the next morning she called a lawyer. What happened next unfolded over approximately 7 weeks, and the details of it are drawn from court documents, federal charging records, investigative accounts, and the kinds of details that surface in cases like this when pieces of them eventually become part of the public record. Lauren Mitchell contacted federal investigators. She was interviewed, and then, almost immediately, she encountered the particular vertigo that comes when you walk into a law enforcement office expecting to report a crime against you and discover that the agencies you are speaking with have been looking for the person you married for the better part of 2 years. They did not tell her everything. They could not. But they told her enough. Enough for her to understand that the man she had built a life with was not a fraud in the narrow personal sense she had originally feared. He was not simply a man who had lied about his money or invented a business to impress a woman. What he was ran considerably deeper and considerably darker than that. And the implications for her, the documents she had signed, the joint accounts through which money had flowed, the address she shared with him, were serious enough that she initially sat across from investigators not entirely sure whether she was a witness or a suspect. Federal records from cases prosecuted during this period paint a detailed picture of how operations like the one surrounding James Park functioned. The network that investigators were tracking had, according to court documents, I helped fraudulent workers gain employment at more than 300 American companies, generating tens of millions of dollars in wages that were funneled through a chain of financial accounts, some of them held in the names of real American people who had no idea their identities were being used. The Justice Department had described schemes like this as representing a severe threat to both the economic security and national security of the United States. FBI officials stated publicly that the North Korean government had generated millions of dollars for its weapons programs through exactly this kind of activity, relying always on the willingness of people, some knowing, some completely unaware, to provide the American infrastructure that made the money look clean. Lauren Mitchell, by every account in the record, I was among those who had no idea. But proving that, in a federal investigation of this magnitude, is not as simple as saying so. She cooperated fully. She provided investigators with access to everything, every financial record, every communication, every document that bore her name or passed through any account she was connected to. She allowed investigators to monitor her communications with the man she still publicly referred to as her husband. She had to continue behaving as though nothing had changed. She had to answer his calls from overseas. He called every other day, the way he always had, and speak to him the way she always spoke to him, knowing now what she knew. In knowing that people she would never meet were watching and listening and building the kind of evidentiary case that takes months and cannot afford a single moment of panic on the part of the person closest to the target. She did this for 7 weeks. 7 weeks of phone calls. 7 weeks of "I love you" and "I'll be home soon" and "Yes, I walked Charlie this morning." 7 weeks of performance that, by any reasonable measure, should have broken her. He came back through O'Hare International Airport on a Sunday morning in late January. He had texted her the night before with his flight details, the way he always did. She had not gone to pick him up. Federal agents were waiting at the gate instead. According to accounts consistent with how similar operations have been executed, the arrest was swift and quiet, and the kind of thing that most of the people walking through that terminal that morning would not even have noticed. One moment he was walking through an airport, the next he was not. What investigators discovered, and what only partially entered the public record in the way that the most sensitive disclosures sometimes do, obliquely, in footnotes and sealed proceedings and statements made not for attribution, was that the man they had been hunting as a facilitator in a North Korean state-sponsored fraud network was not simply a criminal. He was, or had been, something considerably more complicated. The details of his actual identity, his actual origin, and the precise nature of his relationship to the network he had been embedded in were classified at a level that prevented them from being fully disclosed in open court. Well, what is known, what found its way into the margins of the public record, confirmed by multiple people with knowledge of the case, is that he had originally entered the United States carrying documentation provided not by a criminal enterprise, but by an intelligence apparatus. That the network he was embedded in was not, from his perspective, purely criminal. And that the question of who exactly he had been working for, and whether any of that work had ever been, in some legally and diplomatically impossible way, sanctioned, was one that produced enough jurisdictional complexity to stall the case for months in ways that the official record does not fully explain. There are cases like this one, cases where the architecture of international intelligence, state-sponsored economic crime, and an individual human deception overlap in ways that make the word criminal feel inadequate. And they almost never end cleanly. They end with sealed proceedings. They end with extraditions that are negotiated quietly between governments who both have reasons to keep things quiet. They end with a file that is technically closed, but never quite resolved. Lauren Mitchell was cleared. The investigation concluded that she had no knowledge of and no willing participation in any aspect of the scheme surrounding the man she had married. The joint accounts were frozen and later released to investigators. Her name, after months in the shadow of a federal investigation she had not asked to be part of, was removed from the case entirely. She filed for divorce. In the legal paperwork, but she was required to list the marriage as having been contracted under false pretenses. Because her husband's legal name, the name on the marriage certificate, the name she had spoken in front of a judge and 14 people she loved, was not a real name. It belonged, according to court documents, to a real person, someone who had never been to Chicago, never worn a suit to a charity gala, never ordered champagne at a rooftop bar in the Loop, whose identity had been lifted years earlier from a database and reconstructed into a human being who then walked into Lauren Mitchell's life and asked her to spend the rest of hers with him. The court, in its formal dissolution of the marriage, noted that no valid legal marriage had technically ever existed, which is perhaps the most cold and clinical way imaginable to describe the end of something that had, regardless of what it was built on, felt completely real. She has not spoken publicly about any of this. There is no interview on record. There is no memoir. There is no social media presence that postdates the investigation. What exists is a woman who went back to her condo, her dog, her Friday dinner reservation at the same Italian restaurant, and the life she had built before any of this happened. A life that was, it turned out, solid enough to return to. That is the part of the story that does not get told often enough. Not the deception, not the arrest, not the classified proceeding or the sealed record or the diplomatic complexity of a case that reached from a charity gala in Chicago to a government on the other side of the world. The part that matters most is the woman who sat down on the floor of her office at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, looked at 3 passports with 3 different names, and was careful enough and strong enough and smart enough to be still, to think, and then, in the morning, to make the right call. The man who called himself James Park was extradited. The exact nature of the proceedings, which government received him, what charges were ultimately adjudicated, and under what name, is not in the public record. The money, tens of millions of dollars, moved through a network that spanned 3 continents and embedded itself inside hundreds of American companies, was never fully recovered. And the operatives who had been working inside those companies, the ones who had been earning salaries in the names of people who had never applied for any job, continued to surface in new investigations, under new names, for years afterward. Because that is the nature of a network like this one. You can arrest one person, you can dismantle one cell, you can freeze one set of accounts and seal one set of records, but the infrastructure, the stolen identities, the forged documents, the shell companies, the practiced facility with reinvention, does not simply stop when one person is removed from it. It finds another James Park. It builds another story. It walks into another room and introduces itself with a name that does not belong to it and a smile that has been calibrated specifically to make someone feel found. And that is perhaps the most important thing to take from this story. Not that the world is full of deceivers. Most people are not deceivers, but that the most dangerous kind of deception is not the crude kind. It is not the obvious lie. It is the kind of deception that is built around something true. Because the man who called himself James Park was, in some ways that Lauren Mitchell did not invent and was not wrong to perceive, a real person. The attention he paid her was real attention. The effort was real effort. The life they built together, however it was constructed, was a real life, lived in real time, on real mornings with a real dog and real dinners, and all the small, unremarkable tenderness that constitutes an actual marriage. That reality does not excuse anything. It does not reduce the scope of the harm or the scale of the fraud, but it does make it human. It makes it the kind of thing that could happen to anyone who has ever sat across from someone and thought, I think I know who you are. Because the truth, the hardest truth this story leaves us with, is that sometimes you don't. And the person who seems most clearly to have found you may simply be the person who is best at making you believe they did. Now we want to hear from you. If you were Lauren Mitchell, if you had found those 3 passports in that D,